The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. Maria rolled over in her tiny studio apartment, her body aching from yesterday's double shift. The walls were thin, and she could hear her neighbor's baby crying through the paper-thin walls. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, and looked around at her small world. Her apartment wasn't much to look at. A bed that doubled as a couch, a mini fridge that hummed too loudly, and a hot plate that barely worked. But there was one thing that made this cramped space feel like home, an old keyboard pushed against the far wall. It wasn't a real piano, just a cheap electronic one she'd bought at a pawn shop. But when she pressed those keys, magic happened. Maria got dressed in her work uniform, black pants, white shirt, and comfortable shoes that had seen better days. She caught her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror and sighed. At 28, she looked older than her years. Working 2 jobs will do that to you. But her eyes still held something special, something that hadn't been crushed by years of serving people who looked right through her. She grabbed her bus pass and headed out into the cold morning air. The city was just waking up, and she could see other early workers rushing to catch buses and trains. Everyone looked tired. Everyone looked like they were carrying invisible weights on their shoulders. The bus ride to the Meridian Hotel took 45 minutes. Maria used this time to mentally prepare for another day of being invisible. She'd learned that rich people had a special talent for looking right through service workers. To them, she wasn't a person with dreams and hopes. She was just someone who brought them drinks and cleaned up their messes. The Meridian Hotel was the kind of place that made you feel small just by walking into it. Marble floors so shiny you could see your reflection, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people made in a year, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Maria had been working here for 3 years, and she still felt out of place every single day. She clocked in at exactly 7 a.m. and went to the staff locker room to get ready for her shift. The other servers were already there, chatting about their plans for the weekend. Maria smiled and nodded, but she didn't really join in. They were nice people, but they wouldn't understand her real dreams. How could she explain that every night? She went home and played piano until her fingers hurt. How could she tell them that she used to study at one of the most famous music schools in the world? The morning shift started with setting up the breakfast service. Maria moved through the dining room like a ghost, placing silverware and folding napkins with practiced precision. The guests began filtering in around 8, business people in expensive suits, tourists with cameras around their necks, and families who spoke in hushed tones like they were in a library. "Excuse me, miss," called out a woman in a pearl necklace that probably cost more than Maria's rent. "This coffee is cold. Can you bring me a fresh cup?" Maria smiled politely. "Of course, ma'am. Right away." She'd heard this same complaint 100 times before, even though the coffee was perfectly fine. Some people just liked to complain because they could. Maria brought a new cup and received no thank you, just a dismissive wave. By lunchtime, Maria's feet were already starting to hurt. The lunch crowd was different from breakfast, louder, more demanding, and somehow even more entitled. She served salads that cost $30 and sandwiches that most people couldn't afford. All the while, she kept thinking about the old keyboard in her apartment, about the songs she'd play when she got home. During her break, Maria walked through the hotel's main lobby. This was her favorite part of the building because of the grand ballroom. Through the glass doors, she could see the most beautiful thing in the entire hotel, a massive grand piano that sat in the center of the room like a sleeping giant. It was a Steinway, the kind of piano that professional musicians dreamed of playing. Maria had only seen one up close once before, back in her Juilliard days. That felt like a lifetime ago now, but she could still remember the weight of those keys, the way they responded to every touch, every emotion. She pressed her face against the glass and imagined what it would feel like to sit at that bench again. Her fingers moved slightly, as if she was playing an invisible piano. For just a moment, she could almost hear the music in her head. Chopin, Rachmaninoff, all the pieces she used to play when she thought she'd become a famous pianist. "Maria!" The sharp voice snapped her back to reality. It was Mrs. Henderson, the head of housekeeping, and she looked annoyed. "Your break ended 5 minutes ago. We have a big event tonight. and everything needs to be perfect. Sorry, Mrs. Henderson. I'm coming right now. Maria hurried back to work, but she couldn't stop thinking about that piano. Tonight was the big charity gala, the kind of event where tickets cost more than she made in a month. She'd be working late, serving drinks to people who probably spent more on their jewelry than she spent on rent in a year. The afternoon flew by in a blur of preparations. The kitchen staff was rushing around preparing fancy appetizers with names Maria couldn't pronounce. The event coordinators were running around with clipboards checking and double-checking every detail. Everyone was stressed because this wasn't just any party. This was the Thornfield Foundation Gala, and apparently, some very important people would be attending. Maria was assigned to serve drinks during the cocktail hour. She ironed her uniform extra carefully and made sure her hair was pulled back neatly. Mrs. Henderson had warned all the staff that they needed to be invisible tonight. Do their jobs perfectly, but don't draw any attention to themselves. As the sun began to set, the guests started arriving. Maria watched through the service doors as men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns walked into the ballroom. Their jewelry caught the light from the chandeliers, and their laughter echoed off the marble walls. They looked like they belonged in a movie, like they lived in a completely different world from hers. The ballroom had been transformed for the evening. Round tables covered in white linens filled the space, each one decorated with flowers that probably cost more than Maria's weekly grocery budget. The lighting was soft and warm, making everything look magical. And there, in the center of it all, was that beautiful piano. Maria learned that a famous pianist was supposed to perform tonight. His name was Victor something. She couldn't remember his last name, but apparently he was a big deal. The event coordinator had been talking about him all week, about how lucky they were to get him to perform at their little charity event. As Maria picked up her tray of champagne glasses, she took one last look at the piano. The lid was open, and she could see the keys gleaming under the lights. For just a second, she imagined herself sitting there, her fingers dancing across those keys, playing for an audience that would actually listen, but that was just a dream. Tonight she was just the waitress, just another invisible person making sure the important people had everything they needed. She straightened her shoulders, picked up her tray, and walked into the ballroom to begin another night of being unseen. Little did she know that by the end of this evening, everything would change. The ballroom buzzed with excitement as Maria moved between the tables, carrying trays of expensive champagne. The guests were already arriving in their finest clothes, women in sparkling dresses that probably cost more than Maria's entire wardrobe, and men in perfectly tailored tuxedos that fit them like second skin. Everyone looked relaxed and happy, chatting about their vacation homes and business deals. Maria tried to stay focused on her work, but she couldn't help stealing glances at the beautiful piano. It sat there waiting, like a sleeping beauty ready to come alive. The evening's program said that Victor Petrov would perform at 9 o'clock sharp. Maria had looked him up on her phone during her break. He was a world-famous pianist who had played in concert halls across Europe, the kind of musician she had once dreamed of becoming. "Excuse me, waitress," called a woman with diamonds dripping from her ears. "Could you bring me a glass of white wine instead? This champagne is too bubbly for my taste." Maria nodded politely and took the barely touched champagne glass back to the bar. She'd seen this before. People who ordered expensive drinks just to send them back, not because there was anything wrong, but because they could. It was a way of showing power, of reminding people like Maria who was in charge. The evening was flowing smoothly until about 8:30. Maria was refilling water glasses when she noticed some commotion near the back of the ballroom. Patricia Whitmore, the event coordinator, was rushing around with her phone pressed to her ear. Her face had gone pale, and she kept running her hands through her carefully styled hair. "What do you mean he's in the hospital?" Patricia's voice carried across the room even though she was trying to whisper. "The performance is supposed to start in 30 minutes. Maria pretended to arrange flowers on a nearby table while listening to the conversation. From what she could gather, something had happened to Victor Petrov. Food poisoning, someone mentioned. He'd been rushed to the emergency room and wouldn't be able to perform tonight. Patricia's assistant, a young man who looked like he was about to have a panic attack, was frantically scrolling through his phone. "I've called every pianist in the city," he said, his voice shaking. "Everyone is either booked tonight or not answering their phone. It's Saturday night. All the good musicians are already performing somewhere else." Maria watched as Patricia's perfectly composed mask began to crack. This was her event, her responsibility. 300 of the city's most important people had paid $1,000 each to attend this gala. They weren't just here for the food and drinks. They'd come expecting world-class entertainment. "What about the piano teacher from the university?" the assistant suggested desperately. "She's 75 years old and hasn't performed publicly in decades," Patricia snapped. "These people expect professional quality. We can't just put anyone up there." Maria felt her heart racing. She knew she should mind her own business, continue serving drinks and stay invisible like she was supposed to. But something inside her was stirring. Something she'd kept buried for 3 long years. The guests were starting to notice that something was wrong. Conversations were getting quieter, as people sensed the tension among the staff. Patricia was trying to keep smiling, but Maria could see the desperation in her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia announced, her voice slightly strained, "we're experiencing a small delay with tonight's musical program. Please continue enjoying your drinks and appetizers." But Maria could see that the crowd was getting restless. These were busy, important people who valued their time. They'd arranged their schedules around this event, and they expected everything to go perfectly. "Maybe we could just cancel the music portion?" the assistant whispered to Patricia. "Absolutely not," Patricia hissed back. The Thornfield Foundation raised $500,000 last year, and music was a huge part of what made the evening special. If we can't deliver what we promised, our reputation will be ruined. No one will come to next year's gala. Maria continued serving, but her mind was racing. She thought about the old keyboard in her apartment, about the hours she spent every night playing the pieces she'd learned at Juilliard. She thought about her professor, Dr. Chen, who used to tell her that she had a gift that shouldn't be wasted. But that was years ago. She was out of practice. She hadn't performed for a real audience since her student days. What if she'd forgotten everything? What if her fingers stumbled over the keys? What if she embarrassed herself in front of all these important people? "Don't care what it costs," Patricia was saying into her phone. "Find me a pianist who can be here in the next 20 minutes, and I'll pay triple their usual fee." The person on the other end must have said no because Patricia's shoulders slumped in defeat. She ended the call and stared at the piano like it had personally betrayed her. Maria set down her tray and took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking slightly, but not from nerves, from excitement. For the first time in 3 years, she felt that old familiar fire in her chest, the feeling she used to get right before a performance. She walked over to where Patricia was standing, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Excuse me, Ms. Whitmore?" Patricia looked up, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "What is it? I'm dealing with a crisis here." Maria swallowed hard. "I heard about the pianist situation. I might be able to help." Patricia's eyebrows shot up. "Help how? Do you know someone who could perform tonight?" "Actually," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can play piano." Patricia stared at her for a moment, then let out a short, bitter laugh. "I'm sure you can play Happy Birthday or Chopsticks, but we need a professional-level performance. These people have heard the best musicians in the world." "I studied at Juilliard," Maria said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Patricia's expression changed from dismissive to confused. "You what?" "I studied classical piano at Juilliard, School of Music in New York. I was there for 2 years before I had to leave because of financial problems." Patricia's assistant had stopped his frantic phone calls and was staring at Maria with his mouth open. "You're telling me," Patricia said slowly, "that you've been serving drinks at my events for 3 years and you're a trained classical pianist?" Maria nodded, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I know it sounds crazy, and I understand if you don't believe me, but I could show you if you'd like. I mean, if you're desperate enough to consider it." Patricia looked at the piano, then back at Maria, then at the crowd of expectant guests who were starting to check their watches. "How desperate am I?" she muttered to herself. Then, louder, "Fine. You have 5 minutes to prove you're not wasting my time. But if you can't actually play, if this is some kind of joke, you're fired." Maria's heart was pounding as she followed Patricia toward the stage. She was about to either fulfill a dream she'd given up on years ago, or make the biggest fool of herself in front of 300 of the city's most influential people. Either way, her life as an invisible waitress was about to end. Maria's legs felt like jelly as she walked toward the piano. Every step felt like it took forever, and she could feel Patricia's eyes burning into her back. The ballroom suddenly felt enormous, and the beautiful Steinway looked both inviting and terrifying at the same time. 5 minutes, Patricia reminded her, checking her expensive watch. "That's all you get." Maria nodded, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. Her hands were trembling as she approached the piano bench. It had been so long since she'd sat at a real piano. Not the cheap keyboard in her apartment, but an actual grand piano with weighted keys and perfect acoustics. She sat down slowly and adjusted the bench to the right height. The familiar motion brought back a flood of memories from her Juilliard days. She remembered her first day at school, how nervous she'd been, how the other students seemed so confident and talented. But she also remembered the feeling of belonging, of being surrounded by people who understood that music wasn't just a hobby. It was life itself. The piano keys gleamed under the ballroom lights. Maria placed her hands in position, feeling the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. For a moment, she just sat there, letting herself remember what it felt like to be a musician instead of a waitress. "Any time now," Patricia said impatiently. "My guests are waiting." Maria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about all the nights she'd come home exhausted from work, her feet aching and her back sore, and still found the energy to play her little keyboard. She thought about the dreams she'd given up, the life she'd planned that had been torn away when her family lost their house and she had to drop out of school to work. Then she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the empty space around the piano. Maria's fingers moved automatically, muscle memory taking over after years of practice. The melody was haunting and beautiful, starting soft and gentle before building into something more powerful. Patricia's jaw dropped. This wasn't some amateur, plinking around on the keys. This was professional-level playing. The kind of performance you'd expect to hear at Carnegie Hall, not from a waitress in a hotel ballroom. Maria let herself get lost in the music. All the stress and worry melted away as she played. This was who she really was, who she'd always been underneath the uniform and the polite smiles. Her fingers danced across the keys, and for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The piece was technically challenging, full of rapid runs and complex harmonies, but Maria played it flawlessly. Her years of practice on the cheap keyboard had kept her skills sharp, even if she hadn't realized it. Every night of playing alone in her apartment had been preparing her for this moment. As the final notes faded away, the silence in the ballroom was deafening. Patricia stood frozen, staring at Maria like she was seeing her for the first time. Even her assistant had stopped checking his phone and was gaping at the piano. "How?" Patricia whispered. "How is this possible? You've been working here for 3 years. How did we not know?" Maria turned on the bench to face her. "You never asked. Nobody ever asks waitresses about their dreams." Patricia's expression shifted from shock to something that looked almost like guilt. She'd seen Maria hundreds of times over the years, had probably said good job or thank you in that absent way employers do with staff they don't really see as people. But she'd never once wondered what Maria's story was, what she did when she wasn't serving drinks and cleaning tables. That was... Patricia struggled to find the words. That was incredible, I mean, really incredible. Where did you learn to play like that? I told you, Juilliard. I was studying classical performance before I had to leave. Maria's voice was quiet, but there was pride in it now. For the first time in years, she felt proud of who she was. Why did you have to leave? Maria hesitated. This wasn't a story she told often. My father got sick, cancer. The medical bills ate up everything we had. We lost our house, and I had to drop out of school to work and help support my family. He died 2 years later, but by then it was too late to go back. I couldn't afford the tuition, and I'd already been out too long. Patricia's expression softened. I'm sorry. I had no idea. Most people don't, Maria said simply. When you're a waitress, people don't usually ask about your education or your dreams. They just want their drink served with a smile. The assistant finally found his voice. Patricia, the performance is supposed to start in 15 minutes. The guests are getting restless. Patricia looked at Maria, then at the piano, then back at Maria. Would you be willing to perform tonight? For real, I mean. In front of all these people? Maria's heart started racing again. Playing, for Patricia, was one thing, but performing for 300 wealthy strangers was something else entirely. These were people who attended symphony concerts and opera performances. They knew good music when they heard it. I don't know, Maria said honestly. I haven't performed for an audience in years. And look at me, I'm wearing my work uniform. These people are expecting someone like Viktor Petrov, not their waitress. We can fix the clothes, Patricia said quickly. My assistant can find you something appropriate to wear. As for the performance, Maria, what you just played was better than half the professional concerts I've attended. You have real talent. Maria looked out at the ballroom, where the guests were mingling and chatting, completely unaware that their evening's entertainment was being decided by a conversation between their event coordinator and someone they'd barely noticed serving their drinks. What if I mess up? Maria asked. What if I freeze up there or forget the music or make a fool of myself? What if you don't? Patricia countered. What if this is exactly what you're supposed to be doing? What if this is your chance to get back to the life you were meant to live? Maria thought about her tiny apartment, about the years of serving people who didn't see her as a real person, about the dreams she'd packed away like old clothes she'd outgrown. Then she thought about how it felt to play that Chopin piece. How right it felt to have her hands on real piano keys again. What would I play? She asked. Patricia smiled. The first genuine smile Maria had seen from her all evening. Whatever you want. This is your moment, Maria. Play what speaks to you. Maria stood up from the piano bench and looked at the beautiful Steinway one more time. In a few minutes, she'd either be sitting at this piano as a performer instead of a server, or she'd be looking for a new job. But for the first time in years, the risk felt worth taking. Okay, she said quietly. I'll do it. Patricia's assistant was already on his phone, probably calling someone about clothes. Patricia herself looked like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Thank you, Patricia said, and Maria could tell she meant it. You're saving my career tonight. Maybe, Maria replied. You're saving mine too. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur. Patricia's assistant, David, had somehow managed to find a black evening jacket that fit Maria reasonably well. It wasn't perfect, but it covered her white server's shirt and made her look more like a performer than a waitress. Maria caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror backstage and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Your hair, Patricia said, reaching over to pull out Maria's ponytail. Let it down. It looks more elegant that way. Maria's dark hair fell around her shoulders, and suddenly she looked different. Not like the invisible server who had been carrying drinks an hour ago, but like someone who belonged on a stage. Her hands were still shaking, but now it was from anticipation more than fear. Remember, Patricia said, adjusting Maria's collar. These people have no idea who you are. To them, you're just the replacement performer. They don't know you're one of our staff members. Should I tell them? Maria asked. That's up to you, Patricia replied. But honestly, I think it might be better to let the music speak for itself first. Through the backstage curtains, Maria could see the ballroom, filling up as guests returned to their tables. The dinner service was finishing up and people were settling in with their coffee and dessert, ready for the evening's entertainment. She counted at least 300 people, more than she'd ever performed for, even in her student days. A.M. Lights dimmed slightly and Patricia walked to the small stage where a microphone had been set up. The crowd gradually quieted down, conversations fading as people realized the show was about to begin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia's voice carried clearly through the ballroom, "we have a very special surprise for you this evening. Due to unexpected circumstances, our originally scheduled performer is unable to join us tonight. However, we're delighted to present a remarkable pianist who has graciously agreed to perform for us." Maria heard her cue and took a deep breath. This was it, the moment that would either change her life or end in complete humiliation. She walked onto the stage, her legs feeling unsteady, but somehow carrying her forward. The applause was polite, but lukewarm. She could see confused faces in the audience. They'd been expecting Viktor Petrov, the famous European pianist, not this unknown woman in a borrowed jacket. Some people were still chatting quietly, not really paying attention yet. Maria sat at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly. The beautiful Steinway gleamed under the stage lights, and she placed her hands gently on the keys. The ballroom wasn't completely quiet. She could hear the clink of coffee cups, whispered conversations, the rustle of expensive fabric as people shifted in their seats. She closed her eyes for a moment and thought about why she was here. Not for the money or the recognition, but because music was who she was. It was the truest part of herself, the part she'd hidden away for too long. Maria began with something soft and familiar, the opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune. The melody floated through the ballroom like a gentle breeze, delicate and dreamlike. Gradually, the chatter began to die down as people started to actually listen. The piece was beautiful but not showy. It drew people in rather than demanding attention. Maria's fingers moved gracefully across the keys, each note perfectly placed. She could feel the audience settling, their attention slowly shifting from their conversations to the music. As the piece ended, the applause was warmer, more genuine. People were starting to realize that whoever this mystery pianist was, she knew what she was doing. For her second piece, Maria chose something more dramatic, Chopin's Revolutionary Etude. This was a piece that demanded attention, full of thundering bass notes and lightning-fast runs that showcased technical skill. Her left hand pounded out the dramatic bass line while her right hand flew across the keys in intricate patterns. Now the ballroom was completely quiet. Every conversation had stopped, every coffee cup had been set down. All eyes were on Maria, as she commanded the piano with confidence and passion that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. The piece built to a powerful climax, Maria's whole body involved in the performance, her face showing the intensity of the music. When the final notes crashed through the ballroom, the silence that followed was different. It was the kind of silence that happens when an audience has been truly moved. Then the applause began, and it was nothing like the polite clapping from before. People were genuinely impressed, some even standing up. Maria looked out at the crowd and saw faces that were no longer polite but amazed. But she wasn't done yet. For her third piece, she chose Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, or at least the parts she could play without an orchestra. This was the piece that had made her fall in love with piano when she was a teenager, the piece that had convinced her to audition for Juilliard in the first place. The opening notes were haunting and romantic, and Maria poured every emotion she'd been holding in for the past 3 years into the music. All the frustration of being invisible, all the sadness of dreams deferred, all the hope she'd tried to keep alive. It all came flowing out through her fingertips. This wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a conversation between Maria and everyone who had ever felt overlooked or forgotten. The music spoke about resilience, about keeping beauty alive even in difficult circumstances, about the part of ourselves that refuses to give up even when everything else falls apart. As she played, Maria noticed something magical happening in the audience. People weren't just listening, they were feeling something. She saw a woman wipe tears from her eyes, saw a man lean forward in his chair, completely absorbed. These wealthy, sophisticated people who had seen the world's best performers were being moved by the music of someone they'd walked past dozens of times without seeing. The piece reached its soaring climax, and Maria felt like she was flying. This was what she'd been born to do, what all those years of practice and dreaming had been leading to. not performing for these specific people or in this specific place, but simply sharing the music that lived inside her. When the final notes faded away, the silence lasted for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, one person began to clap, then another. Then suddenly the entire ballroom erupted in applause, unlike anything Maria had ever heard. People weren't just clapping. They were standing, cheering, calling out "Bravo." The sound washed over Maria like a wave, and for a moment she felt overwhelmed. She stood up from the piano bench and took a bow, her heart pounding with adrenaline and joy. But the applause didn't stop. If anything, it got louder. People were genuinely moved by what they'd heard, and they wanted her to know it. Some of the guests near the front were trying to get her attention, gesturing for her to come closer. As Maria walked to the front of the stage, she saw faces in the crowd that were looking at her with something she'd never seen before. Respect. Not the polite acknowledgement that rich people gave to service workers, but genuine respect for her as an artist. For the first time in 3 years, Maria felt like herself again. The applause seemed to go on forever. Maria stood at the edge of the stage, overwhelmed by the response. She had expected polite clapping at best, maybe some disappointed faces when people realized she wasn't the famous pianist they'd been promised. Instead, she was looking out at 300 people who were genuinely moved by what they'd heard. As the applause finally began to die down, Maria noticed people weren't returning to their seats. Instead, they were moving toward the stage. A distinguished older man with silver hair was the first to reach her. "That was absolutely extraordinary," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Hayes, director of the City Symphony Orchestra. I've been in music for 30 years and I rarely hear talent like yours." Maria shook his hand, still trying to process what was happening. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." "Where have you been performing?" Dr. Hayes asked. "I thought I knew all the serious pianists in the city." Before Maria could answer, another person approached, a woman with kind eyes and an expensive handbag clutched in her hands. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I had to tell you, your performance made me think of my daughter. She passed away 5 years ago and she used to play piano. The way you played that Rachmaninoff piece, it was like hearing her again." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes and Maria felt her own throat tighten with emotion. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said softly. "Music has a way of connecting us to the people we love, doesn't it?" The woman nodded and squeezed Maria's hand before moving away. But more people were waiting to talk to her. A younger man in an expensive suit stepped forward. "I'm James Morrison," he said, handing her a business card. "I'm a music producer. Have you ever thought about recording an album?" Maria stared at the card in her hands. 6 hours ago, she'd been worried about getting her tables cleared on time. Now a music producer was asking about recording contracts. I don't really know," she said honestly. "This is all very sudden." "Of course it is," James said with a smile. "But talent like yours shouldn't be hidden. Here's my card. Call me when you're ready to talk about your future." Patricia appeared at Maria's side, looking like she was still in shock. "Maria, there are reporters here from the city newspaper. They want to do an interview about tonight." "Reporters?" Maria felt dizzy. "But you're not just anything anymore," Patricia said firmly. "What happened tonight was special. People are going to want to know your story." Over the next hour, Maria found herself surrounded by people she'd never imagined talking to. There was the president of the Arts Foundation who offered her a scholarship to finish her music degree, a talent agent who specialized in classical musicians, the owner of a prestigious music school who wanted to discuss teaching opportunities. But the conversation that touched her most came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had been sitting at table 12. "Excuse me, dear," Mrs. Chen said in a gentle voice. "I wanted to tell you something. I'm a retired piano teacher and I've taught hundreds of students over the years. What you did tonight, that wasn't just good technique or good training. That was heart. That was someone who truly understands what music is supposed to do." Maria felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "Thank you. That means everything to me. Don't let anyone change that." Mrs. Chen continued, as you move forward in your career, and you will have a career after tonight, remember that the most important thing isn't playing perfectly. It's playing with soul. You have that gift. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Maria found herself sitting alone at the piano, still trying to process everything that had happened. Her uniform shirt was wrinkled under the borrowed jacket. Her feet still hurt from serving drinks for 8 hours, but somehow she felt completely different than she had that morning. Patricia approached with a glass of water and sat down beside her. How are you feeling? Patricia asked. Like I'm in someone else's life, Maria said with a shaky laugh. This morning I was worried about paying my rent. Now people are talking about recording contracts and scholarship offers. You know, Patricia said thoughtfully, I owe you an apology. You've been working here for 3 years and I never once asked you about yourself. I never saw you as anything more than someone who served drinks well and showed up on time. Maria looked at her. Most people don't ask waitresses about their dreams. That's not an excuse, Patricia said. I should have been better. We all should have been better. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the empty ballroom. The tables were being cleared by the other staff members, Maria's, co-workers who had watched in amazement as their quiet colleague transformed into a concert pianist before their eyes. What happens now? Maria asked. That's up to you, Patricia replied. But I have a feeling your days of serving drinks are over. Maria thought about her tiny apartment, about the cheap keyboard that had kept her dreams alive during the darkest years. She thought about her father who had always believed she would make it as a musician someday. She wished he could have been here to see this night. I'm scared, she admitted. What if this was just a fluke? What if I can't live up to what people expect now? Fear is normal, Patricia said. But you know what's not normal? What you did tonight. You took a room full of strangers and made them feel something real. That's not a fluke. That's a gift. Over the next few weeks, Maria's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. The newspaper interview led to a feature story that was picked up by national publications. The scholarship offer was genuine, and she found herself re-enrolled in music school to finish her degree. The recording contract offer was real too, and within 2 months she was in a studio laying down tracks for her debut album. But the change that meant the most to her was simpler than all of that. She woke up every morning excited about the day ahead. She was living the life she'd always dreamed of, using the talents she'd been given to bring beauty into the world. 6 months later, Maria walked onto the stage at Carnegie Hall for her debut solo concert. As she sat at the piano and looked out at the sold-out audience, she thought about that night at the hotel gala. She thought about the moment when she decided to stop being invisible and start being herself. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the concert hall. The same piece she'd played for Patricia that night when everything changed. But now, instead of proving herself to a desperate event coordinator, she was sharing her gift with people who had come specifically to hear her play. As the music soared through the hall, Maria smiled. Sometimes the most extraordinary things happen when we finally have the courage to show the world who we really are. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of bravery to transform not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone who hears us. And sometimes, the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places.